So we talked about Mesopotamia. Now we're here talking about Egypt. We may have to close the blinds a little bit because that's so bright that it's washing out everything on the screen. It's a little better. Matt, we may need to close yours a little bit too. I don't know if we have to go all the way, but at least a little bit. There we go. Sweet. Here's a great aerial view overlooking Egypt. So if you are remembering what we talked about in geography, what body of water are we looking at up here? That is the Mediterranean. Okay. What are we looking at right here? Saudi Arabia. Good. And so what is this body of water here? That is the Nile River. Good. So let's talk about the land a little bit. So as we study Egypt, it's really important to connect Egypt with the Nile River because most of ancient Egypt was right along the Nile. Why do you suppose that was? Right? Yeah, it was a very important water source. Why was water so important in this part of the world? Somebody else, maybe back in this region over here. Why is water so important? Why didn't you have water, Sierra? Yeah, to grow crops. Why couldn't you grow crops without the Nile River? Tristan? Yeah, it's all desert. So it's dry. There's very little to no rainfall in this part of the world. And so therefore, they were very dependent upon the Nile River. And so everybody lived very closely in line with the Nile River. And then they figured out ways to use the Nile for irrigation. And we'll take a look at a video a little bit later on that shows some of that. And when they referred to the Nile, there were two different kingdoms or two different major civilizations along the Nile River. There was an Upper Egypt civilization that is many times referred to as Nubia. And Upper Egypt was actually located further south into Africa. Oh, wait a second. Why would you put Upper Egypt in the southern part of Africa? Or, well, I shouldn't say southern part of Africa. Southern part of the Nile. What do you think, Johnny? Yeah, so the Nile River flows northward. It flows toward the Mediterranean. And so as they saw the flow of the river, and because the river was so important to their society, Upper Egypt actually seemed like it was, well, it was in the south, and the Upper Egypt was part of the beginning of the river. Lower Egypt would be part of the end of the river near the delta that came out in the Mediterranean. Question, you have a question? Okay. So this, you really need to wrap your mind around this because if you don't write yourself a note, you're going to forget. But it's the opposite of what it seems. Upper Egypt is actually in the south and Lower Egypt is actually in the north, right there by the delta coming out by the Mediterranean. So I keep those in mind. And in the early days of Egypt, they were two separate kingdoms. There was Nubia in the south, and there was Egypt in the north. They really didn't have a whole lot of connection with one another. They didn't cooperate a ton. There was some. And it's not until later on that they're going to be united, and their only commonality was their dependence on the Nile River. Because it was a life source for both kingdoms. As some of you mentioned, it watered the crops. It also provided for trade and communication. So this was their highway. Anytime you wanted to send something, you wanted to travel, you got on the Nile and you went. Yes, sir. Bummer. We can grab a sheet of paper and you can write some stuff down on a sheet of paper. Not right now. Probably in a little while, I'll have some time. You can go down there. Just remind me when we have a little bit of a break. Yeah. So trade and communication were also an important part of the Nile as well for the Egyptians because it's kind of what they had to rely upon. Now we jump into their history. Most of Egypt, based off of what we talked about with Noah, these are descendants of Ham that were given this land and that they settled down in this area. We trace it all the way back to Menes, about 3000 BC. He is the first of all the Egyptian pharaohs, the Egyptian kings, to unite both Upper and Lower Egypt. And he brought them together. So that's his big claim to fame, is he united Upper and Lower Egypt into one big empire. As we talked earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, we said that almost every civilization has a roller coaster effect. It has an upward angle where they are growing, they're increasing, they get to the top. At the peak, we call that the golden age of their civilization, and then there's a decline and fall and disappearance of that civilization. Well, Egypt lasts for so long that it actually has 3 golden ages. And so when we look at their history, we're going to characterize it by each of those 3 golden ages. We begin, the first one here is the Old Kingdom. Old Kingdom lasts around 500 years, about 2700 to 2200 BC. Now these dates are approximate. Okay, it might be off by a few years here and there, so they're approximate, but it gives you some frame of reference as to what and when we're talking about these. So each of the kingdoms are characterized as well by a number of things that you should associate with that golden age. So with the Old Kingdom, this is the kingdom built on the pharaohs. And most of you are familiar enough with Egypt to know Pharaoh is like their king, and he was the most important person in their culture. And it was the pharaohs themselves that built up Egypt as we know it, and they built up Egypt with their leadership, their desire for greatness, their desire for wealth. And everything about the Old Kingdom talked about the pharaohs. They were the most important part of the Old Kingdom. And it was through these building up of the pharaohs that many of them were considered gods. Little g, gods. So the people of Egypt and the people that heard of the pharaohs of Egypt believed that these guys had more power than anybody else because of their greatness. And that was the entire emphasis of the kingdom. Let's make the pharaoh as great as we can possibly make him. He's going to spend money on making himself great. He's going to build projects that are going to make the pharaoh great. That is going to be illustrated in the life of Khufu. Now Khufu, he did a number of things for Egypt, but the thing he is best known for is building the Great Pyramid at Giza. That's the one pictured here on the screen. It is one of the oldest and largest pyramids, and one of the pyramids you often see when you Google pyramids. What was the purpose of a pyramid? Yeah, go ahead.
That's exactly what I was about to ask.
The purpose of a pyramid.
Yeah.
Okay. Why did they build them? Why did Khufu want such a large one? Shan? What was the last? Yes. Okay, so it was for preservation. What else? It's for the afterlife. What else?
They built it so because they believed that since the pharaohs would reign forever and ever, and the gods that they wouldn't have a better temple.
Yes. Very good. Hold that thought. Mr. Jones? So it's given the wrong access code, or he's studied the wrong verse? Oh. Oh, I don't, yeah. Okay, gotcha. So he did not communicate that to me well enough. I don't have it set up right now. So yeah, have him email me, and that way I can take care of that, and I'll send it to you. Yep, we'll do that. Thanks. Okay, so back to pyramids. They built these pyramids as their final resting place well, I should say temporary resting place. And if you can imagine, this entire pyramid was built for one guy. You know, we have, when we die, we have a few limited options, most of which we choose a wooden box. We place it in a little 6-foot hole, and that's where we put the human body. They built that. And that's what they built for their pharaohs. Now, inside of these pyramids, what would you expect to find? Traps, gold, treasure. A maze. Okay. Why a maze? That's an interesting one. Why is that? What do you think, Bryce?
Usually people that are new to the lake want to go find treasure and steal.
Okay, so that was part of it, is that they did put traps in there. They did put mazes throughout them, so that way it was difficult for thieves to come in to steal the stuff. Yes, that's part of it too. When you look at this pyramid, what would you expect to see in the background? Behind this pyramid, this picture doesn't show it, but what would you expect to find? Desert. Yeah, me too. Somebody, since many of you are on your computer, go to Google and Google the Great Pyramid of Giza and tell me what you actually see in the background. Yeah, it's a city. Okay, it is not anything that I would have pictured until I started looking at images. And if you get on Google Maps and you do the aerial view and you actually get into Google Maps, you can zoom in so far that you can actually go to a street view and you can see this pyramid and do a little 360 panorama. You can look around and you look into the pyramid on one side, you turn around and it is crowded, congested city. Not exactly what I had imagined there. I thought this would be so more intriguing. However, here we have this 5,000-year-old pyramid or 4,000-year-old pyramid and modern-day city merging with one another. You can go there, you can visit Great Pyramid, they'll tell you all kinds of things about it, and we don't have time to unpack all of that. But associate Khufu with the Great Pyramid at Giza. Inside of that pyramid, he would have been buried. He would have been, most likely many of his family members would have been buried in there as well, with his greatest earthly treasures, believing that he would be able to use those things in the afterlife, which we'll talk more about that a little bit later today as well. We talked about the Old Kingdom, now we need to talk about the Middle Kingdom. This is the second of the 3 golden ages. Again, this one lasts about 500 years as well. And the Middle Kingdom is best known for being the age of the people. So if you think Old Kingdom, they built up the pharaohs. Everything was pointed to the pharaohs. That was the most significant part of their empire. Middle Kingdom, it moves on to the people. So the pharaohs, instead of building things for themselves, and instead of putting money into their own palaces, instead of putting money into their own retirement fund or their own yacht or whatever they have that they're spending their money on, they're spending money on things that are going to benefit the people. And so that's why we give this the age of the people category. Pharaoh's primary attention was on all the infrastructure, on things that would make Egypt better. So they were going to build better roads, they were going to build better cities, they were going to make life better for the common people. This is perhaps the best time to be in Egypt. Of all 3 of the golden ages, they were not necessarily the most powerful military, they weren't necessarily the strongest, but it was good if you were a common Egyptian during this age. Because Pharaoh would have been placing his attention on everybody and on the people for the most part. This is the time in which they built the irrigation canals to help them store water when there were dry seasons, when the Nile would dry up some years. They would make sure to have stored water so that way they could still continue to farm. Generally speaking, this time period was characterized by peace. The people were happy, the people were content, the people were well fed. There were not a lot of enemies. And so, again, this is why it was a golden age, is because it was peaceful and the people were very happy with what was going on. And it's during this time here that we see Joseph come down to Egypt. This was about 1670, 1671 BC, would have been the approximate time Joseph came down to Egypt and was brought into Pharaoh's palace. I want you to take a look at Genesis chapter 41. So find in your Bible, look up on your computer, Genesis chapter 41. I want you to read through the story of Joseph and how he ends up in the court of Pharaoh. So if you don't have access to your computer or Bible, look over the shoulder of a neighbor. You guys read that together. No, today I want you to just read on your own. I don't want to take a long time here to read through this chapter, but I want you to spend some time just you and God's Word. We don't need music in our ears right now. Just that quiet reading, Genesis chapter 41.